Hi, this is Dr. John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture on ancient Greece from my World Civilization Survey. Although we could speak about a far more ancient times than we're going to here, I'm really going to focus on ancient Greece at its height here. And really the time in which we can really see more about the culture of the Aegean Sea, the culture of the ancient Greek world, more so than what had come before it. Now, the first image I'm putting up here may seem to be a violent one, and in fact it is. This is an example of ancient Greek boxing, which, as you can tell, was kind of a no-holds-barred affair. As you can see here, they're not even using gloves. The second image I'll turn to is one that is related. And you can see here, these are people who are running on an ancient Greek vase and running in a track event. And in both cases, you'll notice that there was absolutely no need in the ancient Greek world to wash your uniform because there weren't any. They simply would exercise in the nude. Both of these are meant to remind you of something from the ancient Greek world that we still have today, and that is the Olympic Games. These are important not just to stress that ancient Greeks cared a lot about athletics and care of one's body, but the Olympics also had the role of serving as one of the measures of time in the ancient Greek world. Without a standard way to track time, one of the ways in which ancient Greeks would keep track of events that happened in their timeline was how many years had something happened since such and such an Olympiad. We think that the Olympic Games too were something that helped measure the identity of ancient Greeks, because it was a measure that you had made it in the ancient Greek world, that your settlement was considered to be one that was large and prestigious enough that you would receive that invitation to come to the Olympic Games. So at least part of belonging to the ancient Greek world was first and foremost was athletic, but it was many other things. Here on this piece of ancient Greek pottery, you'll see here these really crudely sketched pieces of writing. And you may wonder why I'm even showing them. The reason is simple. These are some of our earliest examples of the written form of the ancient Greek language. And what we imagine happened was that some of the ancient Greek merchants decided to travel to the ancient Near East. While they were there, they saw writing actually being used, and they became fascinated by it. And they decided to create their own form of an alphabet to be able to render their writing. And just as in the ancient Near East, a lot of some of our early examples of Greek sometimes deal with just economic matters. But once you have a form of writing, then you can use it, for instance, to write down oral poetry to preserve culture for the first time. Well, we know throughout the world of ancient Greece, people would speak different variations, different dialects of the ancient Greek language, but they were likely mutually comprehensible, so people could trade and interact with one another throughout this wider region. To give you some idea of what this region was, the geography we're talking here, I show this map of the ancient Greek world. You'll notice something, well, a few things that are interesting about the shape of this world. And one is that at the center of the ancient Greek world was not a body of land. Instead, what we see here is a body of water, the water being the Aegean Sea here. In effect, the Aegean Sea was really the complete center of the ancient Greek world. Another thing that you'll immediately see is that what we refer to as the modern country of Greece was not what they would have considered to be the Greek world. And so you'll notice, for instance, some of these territories here that are located in what today is modern-day Turkey were actually part of the ancient Greek world. It may be difficult to tell just by looking at a map like this, but we do think that a lot of the ancient Greek world tended to be, first of all, very mountainous, which made it always a challenge to communicate among different regions within the Greek world. And it also made it difficult to be able to plant and harvest, to do agriculture. And so instead of these sort of broad, sweeping plains in which people would plant in other civilizations, by and large in the ancient Greek world, what we tend to see is that there are these small areas, these narrow strips of plain that you can plant things like wheat. But even then you had to deal with the fact that in some areas it was still fairly rocky, and not all of the places in the ancient Greek world really had very good access to water. One of the results of this lack of really a huge amount of agriculture, and really what was somewhat of an overpopulated area, meant that in order to get food that people needed or other items, Greeks tended to look to the sea. And in fact, almost as early as we can see the ancient Greek world, we can see ancient Greeks building ships and beginning to go out and trade. And in fact, movements on the water were far easier than those by land. And this is part of the reason that when we look at Greek settlements, really none of them are really very far from the water at all. We think that most of these places were designed specifically with the thought that one can go ahead and get on one ship and travel where one needs to go. And so this kind of this intensive engagement with the water was useful for getting items, getting food, but also moving people. And Greeks were constantly on the move in the ancient world. Because especially in the Aegean, what we see is a huge number of people for a relatively small bit of land. Overpopulation was always a concern. And so often what ended up happening is ancient Greeks would then use the same exact ships and travel to elsewhere by ship to found new colonies. And you can see here that they end up all over the place. Some of them, for instance, in modern Spain, some in France, and some even in the Black Sea. The area, excuse me, that we think is really had the largest concentration of ancient Greek colonies in the ancient world was this area here of modern-day southern Italy and Sicily, an area that would be known in the ancient world as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, for the numbers of Greek settlements that came in this region. And if you were to go to southern Italy today, you would actually see some of the examples like this of ancient Greek temples and other buildings that still remain and are evidence of that population that was once there. Although Greeks spread very widely in the ancient world, we do think that there was this awareness that they belonged to one unified kind of society. And the term that is sometimes used to express this is Panhellenism, a term that refers to an all-Greek society. And this means, in fact, that no matter where they went, Greeks were bound together, and they were conscious that they were different and superior to other peoples. One of the signs of this, for instance, is that people who came from the Greek world were not supposed to be enslaved by other Greeks. They often enslaved other peoples. They didn't have a problem with that. But as for Greeks themselves, that was seen to be out of bounds. Another of the components of the ancient Greek identity was religion. I hope in some context you've had the opportunity to read Greek mythology. We won't be doing it in this class very much, but it is really, there's some wonderful stories in these. And we think that ancient Greeks were just as fascinated by these stories about their gods. In reading these myths, it is really what you see is that they really believe that the gods had very complex interactions with one another. In fact, the myths don't necessarily always go together very well. And in fact, for someone who's raised in a theological tradition that wants to see order in the world of the divine, there is very little of it in the ancient Greek world. In fact, well, it wasn't until later minds tried to make sense of what the sort of very sort of scattershot stories, myths that were told about these ancient Greek gods. If there's something that always appears to people about these ancient Greek deities, it is that they're very human in the ways that they behave. Yes, they have more power than humans, but the ways that they interact with one another, their jealousy and pettiness and tendency to do harm to one another, these really, in some ways, seem to us just like any other human, save for the fact they can do things that humans cannot. One of the most popular gods in the ancient Greek world is depicted here. This is an ancient statue of the god Hercules. And I'll stop for a moment to point out that this is one of the most remarkable statues we have from the ancient world, because you notice that it is preserved, a completely bronze statue. This is in fact a very rare thing to have, because in later centuries these things tend to get melted down. We were just very fortunate that this particular statue fell in the water and wasn't recovered until the modern period, which is why we have it. Hercules, the reason why I think ancient Greeks found him so fascinating is that as the result of having done certain tasks, he was able to achieve full divinity. He didn't start his life as being a full god, but by doing things like, for instance, killing this lion, who you'll see the skin of here, that he eventually was able to become a full god. So thus he's sort of an aspirational figure for some Greeks. Other ancient Greek gods, we think, were slightly more otherworldly. One of them, for instance, being this god here, known as Zeus, who is often portrayed as a kind of king over the court of gods. He really, he's especially a sky god. You can see him, for instance, casting a lightning bolt down here. But really viewed as an immensely powerful god. Nearly everyone thought that the gods existed, did rituals to honor them, but you also constantly lived in fear of the question of how did you know what the gods were going to do next? How did you know what they had in store for you? No less than other ancient peoples, we think that Greeks had what are known as oracles. These means to be able to tell the future. And above all else, the shrine, the pilgrimage shrine I'm showing you here in the Greek city of Delphi was the most famous of these. People would come to Delphi. They would line up to get all kinds of important questions answered, sometimes personal ones, sometimes questions of state. When they got there and they were ushered in, they didn't actually speak directly to a god. they spoke to a priestess who was able to be possessed by one of the gods, and thus to provide answers to the petitioners. It is fair to say that many of the answers of the priestess were mysterious, enigmatic. She spoke in something that didn't even appear at times to be a human language, and her handlers would then have to turn her various babblings into something that appeared like a real answer to a question. Even after these things were written down, though, it's fair to say that they appeared like riddles to many people. They were unclear in what they meant. And one could understand as a business model why this makes sense, in as much as if the Shrine of Delphi constantly gave people wrong answers, it's very unlikely people would come back to it again and again. But it was very unclear exactly what the answers were sometimes. But none of that, I should say, stopped people from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Greek world from coming back. Ancient Greece was also a world of books. And the ones that were most popular were the ones that were supposedly written by this great ancient Greek poet, blind poet, it is said, known as Homer. And you may actually be aware of the two main works that are attributed to Homer, the first being the Iliad and the second being the Odyssey. These days, no one really thinks that there was this one literary figure known as Homer. Most people tended to see, for instance, that there were these group of Greek bards, Greek poets, who would circulate around the Aegean and sing all of these different stories that were not until much later cobbled together into these volumes that we know now. And the Iliad often being said to be this story about this prehistoric war that Greeks had fought in. And the Odyssey being the story of one of the ancient Greeks who took part in this battle to try his best to get back to the ancient Greek world. And we know that these works orally probably were performed all the time. They were very popular. We can see here from scraps like this that lots of people also wanted to have copies of these works. Very few people would say that there's much historical in these works, but they can tell us a lot as historians too. And so, for instance, if you want to know something about people's attitudes towards war, the valor that people are supposed to display in war, reading the Iliad and the Odyssey can tell you that about the ancient Greek world. We'll speak more about the form of government that is eventually assumed in the ancient Greek world, but important here to note is that we don't see in the ancient Greek world one king or emperor rising above all other important people in the way that they do in other civilizations in the ancient world. Instead, we really see a civilization where, first of all, there are a lot more aristocrats. There's a lot more money, and these aristocrats all hold on to some land. And we think that they are some of the people who are the movers and shaker of the ancient Greek world. In addition to owning estates, it was also felt that one of the job of the elites in the civilization was to go to war. And war was not just a poor man's game. War, in fact, was seen to be the obligation of the rich, who they would argue were the only people, first of all, who could afford the arms necessary to go to war, but also they were defending their own land as well. And just by looking at this one image, you'll see the kinds of arms that the ancient Greek aristocrats used, sometimes referred to both as hoplite armor And sometimes the soldiers themselves also confusingly referred to as hoplites. And you can see that they had very heavy armor on, large shields, and spears to thrust. These it took a lot of training and practice to get good at working as a unit as hoplites. And we think that really to be successful in battle, you had to sort of work as a unit. So it probably helped to unify these aristocrats as well. And I should say that later on we'll talk more about war, but at least in the earliest sort of phase of war, we can see we don't tend to think that ancient Greek battles were very bloody. Essentially, you would get one group of aristocrats fighting against another, two small settlements. They would push them one another back and forth a little bit. There were a few deaths. Both sides would declare victory, and that would be it. But war will eventually change in nature in the ancient Greek world. There are obviously complex structures and societies underneath aristocrats, although, as we've seen in nearly all the ancient societies we've talked about, they're often hidden from our sources because people, especially our written sources, because people were less interested in them. But there was a large number of freemen and peasants who worked their own land and sometimes other people's land. And another group that we often do not really see as much of in comparison to their importance are women in this civilization. It is fair to say that ancient Greece was another of those places that was really a very strictly patriarchal kind of civilization. Especially the more money you had, the more controlled women were in their lives. Aristocratic women, for instance, would really pass from the control of their fathers to the control of their husbands. Really, the richer you were, rich women tended to rarely leave their own households. This was in part this fear that that women would go off and have affairs with someone else. Men wanted to be secure in the knowledge that their children were their own. Interestingly enough, again, the less money you had, peasant women did actually have more freedom to, for instance, we know at times to run a business or something like that. You could do. For many women, the attitude was that their main job was to raise children, to take care of the household, to do work in the household, like for instance weaving clothing. Another group that we know were there that we don't hear as much of, but we know certainly had a part in ancient Greek civilization, were slaves, such as this slave is helping his drunken master home from a party. We don't see quite as endemic of amount of slavery as in the ancient Roman example, but we do think that most farms tended to have a few slaves. And here's just another slave who's carrying his master's shield, which you can see is practically bigger than him in this case. After generations of Greek communities living together with all of these sort of commonalities, we gradually see the crystallization of much stronger political bodies. These will in time come to be known as a polis, or polises in the plural. Was the English, the Anglified version of that plural. A polis is something that doesn't have a precise translation into English. The way that people normally translate it or render it is city-state. When we talk about a polis, we are first of all talking about a city. We're talking about the countryside that surrounds the city and helps to make life possible and to do agriculture. But we're also we're talking about a state. We're talking about an area that had its own form of government. And really in the ancient period, until the conquest of Alexander the Great, we're going to see these Greek polises had their own form of government. They could choose themselves. Altogether, there, as you can see here on this map, there we know plenty of polises. The overall number is around 150. In some cases, we really only know the name of an individual polis and practically nothing more. In other cases, we have a lot more information to talk about them. It is too obvious to us that people who lived in a polis didn't just share a geographical space. For instance, within a polis, people would worship the same patron god or goddess of the city. They shared the same culture. Here is of course, an amphitheater. People would partake in, for instance, watching theater. People would take part in the same festivals to honor their gods, including theatrical performances. And people in these different city-states were thought to have to assemble for various reasons. The area that almost invariably we find as part of these polises, the area at the center of them, is something known as an agora. An agora is an area where people could sell things, sell your wares, where culture could be consumed. You could, do singing of poetry, for instance. Agoras were also areas that were political centers. Really, we think that because there were so many people who had money in the ancient Greek world, and they had already done their part to defend many of these cities, they felt they had the perfect right to assemble and to share their political opinions with one another. And the polis was often the place in which they did that. We do think that most of these polises, although you cannot really speak generally about the exact form of government they adopted, in part because of our ignorance of exactly what it was. But if there is a general trend, most polises did not like when power was too concentrated. And in fact, they found different ways to break apart any sort of, for instance, one-man rule became broadly hated as being tyrannical. That does not mean that everyone immediately adopts democracy. Many of you will know, of course, democracy is the brainchild of the ancient Greek world. And some places, as we'll see in a moment, do go all in for democracy. In other places, you'll see systems of government in which there's some form of collective government. There are different people taking part in government. It's just not necessarily quite as widespread. In many ancient Greek places, for instance, they also will adopt some form of constitution as well, although it does not necessarily have to be written. Because it is very difficult to speak in the abstract about polises, I will now turn to giving you two of the best known examples of polises we have from the ancient Greek world. The first of these, and I'm showing you the image of their coin here, is the city, the polis of Athens. Everyone in the ancient Greek world would immediately have known that this is the coin of Athens. On the head's side, you can see the image of their patron goddess, Athena. On the tail side, you can see an owl, which was meant to be a symbol of wisdom. And you can also see in the right-hand corner the first three letters of the city Athens. Part of the reason why historians always talk so much about Athens is we have more sources, more information about Athens than any other single polis in the ancient Greek world. We have to be very careful when making generalizations based upon the sources from Athens, because it is one of many examples. Part of the sources we've gotten from Athens come from archaeological digs, but in some cases, you can see here, you didn't actually have to even go that far. And in fact, there are freestanding monumental treasures from ancient Athens that are still there. And in particular, this outcropping of rock known as the Acropolis. The Acropolis probably starts as the actual place where very, very ancient Athenians lived, because it was easy to defend a territory that's upraised like this. But in time, it's going to switch over and simply turn into a city center, an agora. And this was a very particular one, in part because of its elevation, in part because it also hosted a lot of culture, and Athenians were known for their culture, in part because it was the center of Athenian government. And as many of you will know already, on top of it, there is the religious temple dedicated to the patron goddess of the city, Athens. Athens itself and really the surrounding region had become really filthy rich, and really in some ways this was because they had a very diversified economy. It had several different sectors. They did a lot of agriculture. You can see here in this image, they actually planted olives, which they then could sell some of that. They sold timber. They made pottery. Really, Athens was one of the powerhouses for pottery. A lot of this ancient Greek pottery was made very cheaply, but these days, of course, it goes for millions of dollars. The Athenians mined a lot, and they traded on top of all that. So they had quite a good deal of money. The Athenians, perhaps more than any other single ancient Greek polis, consistently their government moved in the direction of more power to the people. They're probably the purest example of democracy we have. And in fact, some of the other ancient Greeks thought that they had gone too far in granting power. What we really see here is that there is a collective trust in the judgment of Athenians to be able to handle their own matters. This did not mean that every single person in Athens had the right to be able to take part in this system. When we talk about everyone taking part in the democracy, what we mean is adult men, really. And if you were an adult male, though, you were allowed to publicly go out, debate opinions, be able to vote on things, even of great importance to the state. Should we go to war or not? How should we use our tax money? In fact, people were able to vote on things like, for instance, who would our political and military leaders be. We think that, just on top of these other things, just another example of this belief that everyone should take part in the government was that Athenians essentially create the jury system. Not only did they create it, but the state itself would pay for people who didn't have enough money to sit on juries, so they could actually exercise this right even if they didn't have the huge amount of money. The Athenians were known for sponsoring all kinds of festivals to Athena, and in fact become leaders in the cultural sphere as well. This is just one example. If you have read an ancient Greek play, it is almost invariably from Athens, which had even the ancient world some of the most famous plays, and to this day some of the best preserved plays as well. Another of the very important sort of big dog polises in the ancient Greek world was Sparta. Sparta also had, like many places in the ancient Greek world, a large aristocracy. But politically speaking, they were very conservative. You can get some sense of this just even by looking excuse me, at some of the remains of the structures left over from Sparta that are nowhere near as impressive as other places in the Greek world, like here and here. This lack of great monumental structures is really in some ways on purpose. Sparta did not see the point in expending a lot of money on culture, and so it didn't. Spartan wealth was not well diversified. The society was overwhelmingly agricultural. They did not engage in trade, and they didn't bother with colonies as well. Yet there really is something that's very different about Spartan polis and how they organize their entire society. And that is to say that it is one that is intended to be very equal in the way that its adult men are treated. And the way they do this is by essentially funneling all their energies into a military-based system. In that military, everyone was supposed to be equal, wasn't supposed to show any distinctions of wealth or comfort. People were supposed to live in military barracks together. They were supposed to eat communal meals. These were not meant to be good. There's a story in the ancient Greek world, for instance, that a traveler once had a meal in Sparta, and at the end of it he said, "I can see now why you Spartans are willing to risk your lives at any moment, and that is just so you'll never have to return to eat this slop ever again." We also think Spartans even dress the same, so it really is this egalitarian ideal. In growing up, all men were supposed to train and retrain to be in the military. Now, one of the questions you may have, of course, is if all men are essentially serving in the military, who is feeding these Spartans? In effect, the Spartans solved this problem also through military means. They used this very strong military to end up conquering some of their near neighbors, I should say. And they ended up taking these neighbors and reducing them to a very interesting status referred to as helots. Helots were not slaves, but they were also not exactly free either. They were bound to the land. Really, perhaps even worse, they had to surrender a great deal of their agricultural produce to the Spartans. If they did not, the fear was the Spartans would again use their military to keep them in check. We think that at times too the helots were treated extremely badly by the Spartans. They would, for instance, force them to get drunk and then make fun of them. You'll notice too that having this large body of people who the Spartans had to constantly watch over lest they revolt, and for good reason, meant that there was an element of instability in Sparta always. Spartans did not want to engage in warfare for extended periods outside of their homeland. Now, I had mentioned to you earlier that war was, generally speaking, on a fairly small scale in the ancient Greek world. But this will change. And in fact, the ancient Greeks are going to end up engaging in a series of two wars that are formative for their future. The first of which is against external foes, and the second of which is an internal or civil war. The first major war I'll discuss is a war against the Persian Empire. I'm not going to talk much about the Persian Empire now because we're going to have an entire lecture later in the course. It is fair to say, however, that the Persian Empire was a vast empire to the east of the Greek world that could call on an army that numerically was really greatly superior to anything that the Greeks could bring to the field. And we do think that it made a lot of sense for the Persians to want to conquer the Greeks for the richness of the Greek territory, and essentially to reduce the Greeks to the status of one province in their vast domain. The Greeks did, however, have at least some advantages. Here's just one Persian emperor in the face of this invasion. They first of all had the advantage of the leadership of the two polises we've been talking about, Athens and Sparta. Athens was known for having an excellent navy, and Sparta was known, as we've said, for having a fantastic infantry. Both of these powers begin to rally other Greek polises to join this coalition. It was a very strange thing in many cases that these independent Greek polises were joining together, but in the face of overwhelming danger, they really had little choice. We think that the Greeks, in addition to simply having good leadership, we think that one of the other factors that favored them was they really were this hoplite armor, the very heavy kind of armor they had, actually worked well in close quarters against Persians. So whereas Persians preferred to hang back and to shoot arrows, the Greeks wisely would rush right at them, which allowed them then to mow down Persians quickly. We also think that as part of the military tactics that the ancient Greeks adopted against the Persians, they constantly were seeking ways, both on land and in sea, to nullify the numerical superiority that the Persians had, to choose places in which the Persians couldn't use all of their many soldiers, and in that way were able to defeat them. On top of all those other things, we do think that the Greeks were defending their homeland, and they were really defending terrain that they knew quite well. All of these things, in essence, really favored the Greeks in this war. Really, although no one could really have foreseen it ahead of this war, we see that battle after battle, the Greeks end up beating the Persians, besting them, and because of this really continual loss of men and material, the Persians will make the rational decision to abandon the war. This really led to this remarkable period of self-confidence among the Greeks, which not only had they managed to win a seemingly unbeatable foe, but on top of that, the Greeks felt that they were freemen who were defending their own territory, whereas they were fighting against an eastern tyrant who was really fighting with a bunch of slaves who had no choice but to fight for him. Sad as it is to say, however, after a brief period of happiness after the Persians had been defeated, the Greeks would end up turning on themselves and fighting this internal war known as the Peloponnesian War. At the end of the Persian War, what we see is that the Spartans had absolutely no desire to engage further in international combat, and they were afraid, as they always were, the Helots might revolt. And what ends up happening instead is that it is the Athenians who first of all do a series of mopping up operations, where they attempt to find some of the remaining bases of Persians in the Greek world and drive them out, and generally speaking, to prevent the Persians from coming back and taking territory. Initially, we think that the Athenians would ask for volunteers from other Greek polises to be able to help them, both men and money, to help fight this war. But in time, we really think that the Athenians had become so powerful by absorbing all of this new money that they didn't have to ask for it anymore. They could demand that people pay up as much as they want. And in fact, Athens begins to simply use some of this money for completely different purposes aside from defense. And at least for some skeptics in the Greek world, Athens was beginning to look awfully like an empire itself. This state of affairs worried many in the ancient Greek world, but perhaps no other polis so much as Sparta. And Sparta feared that if Athens were allowed to keep growing in this fashion unchecked, there would be no hope of stopping them in the next generation. So basically, Sparta decides to launch a preemptive war against Athens to knock it off its pedestal. In the initial phase of this war, there really was something of a deadlock. Sparta was very good at land, but didn't really have forces for sea. And the opposite was true of Athens, which had a navy, but not much of a land army. And to some degree, some of the initial fighting happens from some of the allies of either Sparta or Athens, rather than direct conflict between the two of them. To attempt to break the deadlock that had been created by this war, Athens ends up making the decision that they would conquer the island of Sicily, which, as I mentioned earlier, again is a Greek-speaking territory at this time. And they would take it, they would use its men and resources, and then come back to the Greek world and destroy Sparta. This expedition to Sicily ended up proving a complete and utter disaster, in which the Athenians ended up losing a large number of men and almost their entire navy. So this was one of the main factors that helped to weaken Athens. The other thing, and that's very interesting, is that Sparta actually asked for help from none other than the Persians, the old enemies of the Greeks, to be able to build more of a navy and help to wipe out some of the remaining navy of the Athenians, which I should say, by the way, at least for some Greeks, was viewed with extreme disfavor. Finally, though, Sparta does actually manage to win this war. What no one recognized, however, at the time, was that as the result of this war, this internal war, the ancient Greek world had fundamentally exhausted itself, materially, and one could even say psychologically. As long as it didn't have any serious challenges, perhaps the ancient Greek world could simply have rebuilt and really could keep continuous with its old political structures. That was not to be, however, and this kind of weakness that comes in the wake of the Peloponnesian War ends up being exploited by the invasions of Alexander the Great, whom we'll speak about more next time. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll see you later.